Welcome back. In this section, we're going to pick up on U.S. government sanctions programs, multi-agency enforcement, meaning the multiple agencies within the U.S. government that is responsible in some way, shape, or form for enforcing sanctions and embargoes. Could be BIS, could be DDTC, OFAC, etc. We're going to kick off this multi-agency review by starting with the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, and determining what their role is in enforcing sanctions and embargoes. Pursuant to EAR 746, the Bureau of Industry and Security enforces sanctions and embargoes against the following countries and regions: Cuba, Iran, North Korea, the Crimea region of Ukraine, and Syria. As such, we can see right away that BIS has a role to play in addition to and in conjunction with OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. So BIS has a very specific role to play in all of this. A good link that talks about country guidance for sanctioned destinations is provided here and in our bibliography too. If one were to go to the BIS website, it's easy to find the sanctioned destinations of the general BIS website. That's what we're looking at here, the landing page. We'll see some subsequent pages as well, but let's start here, looking specifically at sanctioned destinations. It's easy to see that one can click on Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, Syria. Let's see what it has to say. The Bureau of Industry and Security implements U.S. government sanctions against the countries that we've mentioned, pursuant to the EAR, the regulations that drive the BIS, either unilaterally or to implement United Nations Security Council resolutions. That unilateral one country, one U.S. approach, or the multilateral approach as part of the United Nations. Important to note, second paragraph, the license requirements, license exceptions, and licensing policy vary depending upon the particular sanctioned destination. Of course, in this instance, the country. The corresponding country pages are intended to assist exporters and re-exports with determining the export and re-export requirements pursuant to the EAR. Good summary point at the bottom, exporters and re-exporters should be aware that other U.S. government agencies administer regulations that could also impact their export or re-export transactions. Of course, we've said this a couple of times now. For example, Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control also implement certain sanctions against Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria. The point being that the exporter has to check, has to vet, has to go through screening through multiple agencies. Let's drill down a little bit further just to illustrate what one can find on the BIS website specific to sanctioned destinations by country. Well, by clicking on policy guidance, there's a bunch of lists here, but we're interested in the one called country guidance, which can give us guidance specifically on Iraq or the sanctioned destinations. Once again, North Korea, Sudan, Syria, Cuba, Iran. A great resource there. Depending on the country that we're looking to do business with, we can click on and see what the requirements are from a BIS perspective and how BIS works with other government agencies. By clicking on North Korea as an example, we will see BIS policy for North Korea. So from the previous slide, we click on North Korea, this is what pops up. Same would apply for the other countries as well. Let's see what it says. Well, from a licensing requirements viewpoint, a license is required for the export or re-export to North Korea of all items subject to the EAR other than food or medicine designated as EAR 99. Very, very strict controls over exports to North Korea. The page goes on to talk about license exception, basically defining a license exception as we have on numerous occasions. They go on to say only the license exceptions or portions thereof listed in section 7464C of the EAR are available for North Korea. Clearly, one would have to go to that section to know exactly what it is they're talking about. You may export or re-export to North Korea without an individual validated license if your transaction meets all the applicable terms and conditions of the available license exceptions. Let's make a general statement and declare that the conditions under which a license exception can be used to North Korea are very limited. As far as licensing policy goes, without having to read the whole page, license applications for exports and re-exports of items subject to the EAR are reviewed on a case-by-case basis, except humanitarian items intended for the benefit of the North Korean people, And then any luxury goods, arms, and related materiel, certain items that the UN has determined could contribute to North Korea's nuclear-related, ballistic missile-related, or other weapons of mass destruction-related programs. We're a little bit more interested in the humanitarian items as it relates here, but needless to say, arms and related materiel, not a big chance of getting shipped to North Korea. A little further perspective, we're looking now at BIS policy for Sudan. So we go back 2 slides from the BIS landing page. We click on Sudan. This is what comes up. Sudan eligible for license exception, consumer communication devices. This is a specific license exception. You will recall that we went over consumer communication devices. Let's go down to licensing policy. Just to summarize some of the key points. When you're talking about places like Sudan, Korea, North Korea, etc., the chances of being able to export there other than humanitarian items or certain medical items, very slim. So look at the policy. As described in Section 74210B of the EAR, there is a general policy of denial for exports and re-exports to all end users in Sudan of all items controlled for chemical, biological, missile, and nuclear proliferation reasons. The reasons for control that we've talked about so many times now. Other non-military related items that are controlled to Sudan for national security or anti-terrorism reasons are subject to a general policy of denial for military end users or end uses, and case-by-case review for non-military end users or end uses. Applications, however, this is important, for the export or re-export of items in support of humanitarian assistance programs, including UN efforts, are generally approved. Down the bottom, this is important as well. Item-specific guidance, medicine and medical devices. A license is not required to export or re-export to Sudan medicine or medical devices designated as EAR 99. However, a license is required to export or re-export to Sudan nearly all items on the CCL, including some medicines, such as certain vaccines and immunotoxins. To aid exporters and re-exporters, BIS maintains an illustrative list of EAR 99 medical items. Chances are we're going to see that in just a moment. But this is a good illustration as well of policy specific to Sudan, but also some exceptions as it relates to medicine, medical devices, and humanitarian efforts. The point being, the exporter has to understand all of the rules, all of the regulations from all of the government agencies. This is why screening and understanding the rules and regs is so important. Let's bring another export perspective forward, and it's called the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act. It's a piece of legislation, actually. Kind of lightened up things a little bit as it relates to trade sanctions. First bullet point, the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000 terminated unilateral medical and agricultural sanctions. So it was a piece of legislation that came out in 2000 that basically said any U.S.-specific, on their own, unilateral medical and agricultural sanctions would be terminated. Under the TSRA guidelines, as it's called, BIS assists exporters to identify medical devices, medicines, and agricultural commodities that do not require a commodity classification. Third bullet point, good example of how agencies work together, OFAC works in conjunction with BIS and issues general licenses for the export and re-export of these products to Sudan and Iran. Depending on the nature of a medical product, a specific license may be required. We're talking about general licenses and specific licenses. We'll define those a little bit further when we talk more about OFAC. For now, let's have a little closer look on the BIS website at the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act. This particular landing page has to do with TSRA licensing and classification requests for medical and agricultural items. A classification request meaning, does an item qualify to be shipped pursuant to the TSRA? This section provides exporters with additional guidance to identify medical devices, medicines, and agricultural commodities that do not require a commodity classification from the Department of Commerce, BIS, and that may be eligible for a general license authorization for export and re-export to Iran and Sudan from the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Perfect example of how two agencies are working together. The Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000 Title XYZ provides that the President shall terminate any unilateral agricultural sanction or unilateral medical sanction in effect as of the date of enactment of the TSRA. There's a couple of dates that are reviewed, how this whole thing advanced, but down the bottom, that's what we're most interested in. A note: medical devices that are not included in the OFAC list of basic medical supplies still require a 1-year specific license from OFAC, but may not require a BIS commodity classification as explained below. Needless to say, we're going to have a look at this list and see how it works. Let's move on. We're going to illustrate our previous discussion through an industry vertical, exporting medical items to Sudan. A medical supply wholesaler in Milwaukee, Wisconsin wishes to export a large quantity of disposable hospital products to Sudan. The products that would be included in the initial order include syringes, catheters, single-use medical procedure trays, diagnostic kits, swabs, sponges, and pads. As an experienced exporter, the wholesaler knows that Sudan is in country group E1. We've mentioned E1 a couple of times throughout this module. Within country group E, E1 is a list of countries that support terrorism, which clearly is a distinction that severely limits the ability of U.S. exporters to do business in Sudan. However, the exporter does believe that she may be able to export these items if they are designated EAR 99. How can she be sure? Let's find out. As noted on the previous slide, a license is not required to export or re-export to Sudan medicine or medical devices designated as EAR 99. However, in order to be sure that they are compliant, the medical supply exporter will have to check the products they wish to ship against the comprehensive list of BIS EAR 99 medical items, the list that we referred to just a couple of moments ago. Upon reviewing that list, the exporter confirms that all of the products in the order fall under this designation, so they can indeed export them to Sudan. What does that list look like? Needless to say, what we have here is the continuation of the industry vertical, exporting medical items to Sudan. And we are looking at the comprehensive list of basic medical supplies, general medical equipment and supplies, as EAR 99 items that can be shipped to Sudan without any issues. Let's see if we recognize any of the product descriptions that we saw in the previous slides. Well, right off the bat, syringes, catheters for sure, single-use medical procedure trays and kits, that was on there as well. One might suppose that that's a one-time use kit for drawing blood, perhaps. And then down at the bottom, also swabs, applicators, sponges, pads, all items that were listed in the previous slide. This is where the exporter from Wisconsin would have gone to determine that they could export these items to Sudan. Bearing in mind that BIS is involved and OFAC is involved as well. We're going to stop here, and when we come back, pick up with the U.S. government sanctions programs, the multi-agency approach, but now talking about the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. We're moving away from BIS and going forward with DDTC. An enthralling conversation for sure. Come back as soon as you can.